I used to believe that betrayal announced itself, that it came with shouting, accusations, slammed doors. But the kind that stays with you the longest doesn't look like that at all. It looks like applause. It sounds like praise, just not for you. I met Mara when we were both trying to become someone. We were young, exhausted, and convinced that meaning came from being useful. We volunteered at the same community center, working late nights, planning events no one noticed, solving problems no one wanted to admit existed. She was magnetic. I was steady. People noticed her immediately. Her confidence, her way of speaking like she already belonged wherever she stood. I noticed details instead. Who needed help but never asked. Which systems didn't work the way they claimed to. How easily credit drifted toward the loudest voice in the room. At first, we were a good balance. She spoke. I built. She dreamed out loud. I made those dreams functional. When the nonprofit started gaining attention, it felt like we were growing together. Interviews, grants, invitations to panels. We shared cramped train rides and late dinners, laughing about how surreal it all felt. I trusted her. That's the part people don't understand. Betrayal doesn't start with malice. It starts with familiarity, with comfort, with the belief that someone sees you clearly. The first shift was subtle. She began referring to projects as my initiative instead of ours. She spoke to donors without looping me in. She'd summarize my work for others instead of letting me explain it myself. When I mentioned it once, casually, she laughed. You hate attention anyway, she said. I'm helping. And maybe I did hate attention. But I loved accuracy. Still, I let it go. Growth is messy, I told myself. Success changes people. I didn't want to be the kind of person who counted slights. What I didn't realize was that she wasn't just stepping forward. She was quietly stepping over. As the organization expanded, so did her visibility. She became the face of it. Her name appeared on articles. Her voice was quoted in reports I had written. People started approaching me differently, not as a partner, but as support staff. You work with Mara, right? She's incredible. She built something amazing. I smiled. I nodded. I didn't correct them. Not because I agreed, but because I was starting to understand something important. She had begun rewriting the story, and she assumed I wouldn't notice. But I noticed everything. I noticed how she kept no records of her promises, only impressions. How she thrived in ambiguity. How she avoided written confirmations but loved verbal assurances. I noticed how donors trusted her presence more than process. How boards responded to charisma over documentation. And I noticed how fragile that kind of power really was. There was a moment, a quiet one, when the final line was crossed. We were reviewing a proposal late one evening. I had drafted it, revised it, and prepared the data. She skimmed it, nodded, and said, I'll present this tomorrow. The next day, she presented it. Without my name. Without my contribution. Without a single acknowledgement. When I confronted her afterward, gently, she looked genuinely surprised. Oh, she said. I didn't think it mattered. That was the moment I understood. To her, I wasn't a partner. I was infrastructure. And infrastructure is invisible, until it collapses. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't expose her. I congratulated her. And then I began to prepare. Because when someone builds their success on borrowed structure, all you have to do is step back quietly, and let gravity do the rest. After that night, I stopped thinking of our work as something we shared. I started seeing it the way she did, as something to be claimed. The strange thing was how normal everything looked on the surface. We still exchanged messages. Still attended meetings together. Still laughed at the right moments. Anyone watching from the outside would have said nothing had changed. But internally, something had shifted for me. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped filling in gaps unless I was asked directly. And most importantly, I started keeping my own records. It wasn't paranoia. It was clarity. I began documenting everything. timelines, drafts, email threads, version histories. Not obsessively, not dramatically, just quietly, methodically. I labeled files clearly. I stored backups in places no one else accessed. I treated my work like something that might need to speak for itself one day. Because I was starting to realize that Mara didn't steal ideas outright. She absorbed them. She took the shape of other people's labor and wore it like it had always belonged to her. And the more visible she became, the more she relied on that invisibility, mine. The organization was growing fast now. Too fast, in some ways. New funding meant new expectations. Donors wanted metrics. Boards wanted impact reports. Suddenly, charm wasn't enough. That's where I came in. I built systems. Evaluation frameworks. Reporting pipelines. I turned vague promises into measurable outcomes. It was the kind of work that rarely gets celebrated, but without it, everything collapses. Mara praised me privately. "You're so good at this," she'd say. "I don't know how you do it." Then she'd walk into a meeting and present the results as if they had appeared fully formed. I watched how people responded to her certainty, how they nodded, impressed, how they asked follow-up questions she couldn't fully answer, questions she'd later bring to me. At first, I answered them. Then, slowly, I began to change how I answered. I'd respond with references instead of explanations. "I'll send you the documentation. It's all outlined in the report." I forced things into writing. Mara didn't like that. She preferred fluid conversations, plausible deniability, verbal commitments that could be reshaped later. Every time I insisted on clarity, I could feel her irritation flicker beneath the surface. But she never confronted me directly. She never had to. She was still winning. Invitations multiplied. Panels. Speaking engagements. Media features. Her name began circulating without the organization attached, as if she alone were the work. And I became background. People assumed I handled logistics. That I supported her vision. That I was comfortable where I was. They weren't entirely wrong. Because background is where you see the whole stage. There was one afternoon that crystallized things for me. We were invited to pitch for a major partnership, the kind that could define the organization's future. The preparation was intense. Weeks of data refinement, strategy alignment, risk analysis. I did most of it. The night before the pitch, we stayed late in the office. The building was quiet, lights dimmed, the city humming faintly outside. Mara paced while I reviewed slides. "You think they'll ask about scalability?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It's slide 12. And the compliance concerns. Covered in the appendix." She nodded, satisfied. Then she smiled. "You know," she said, casually, "this is why we work so well. You handle the details. I handle the vision." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. Not because it was untrue, but because of what it erased. The next day, the pitch went well. Very well. The room was engaged. Questions flowed. The partners were impressed. They congratulated Mara. They shook her hand. They asked about her journey. One of them turned to me briefly and said, "And you are?" I told him my name. He nodded politely and turned back to her. That was the moment I stopped feeling hurt. Hurt still clings to the idea that things could be different. What I felt instead was resolve. Because I finally understood the rules of the game we were playing. Visibility without structure is fragile. And structure, once removed, leaves nothing standing. I started noticing small cracks. Mara missed deadlines when I didn't remind her. She overstated outcomes when no data backed them up. She made promises she couldn't operationalize. Not because she was incompetent, but because she'd grown used to someone else catching the fall. And I had always been there. Until I wasn't. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't make mistakes. I simply did my job, and only my job. If something required my input, I waited to be asked. If documentation was missing, I didn't fill it in proactively. I let gaps exist just long enough to be visible. The first time Adona asked a follow-up question she couldn't answer, I saw it, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She recovered quickly. She always did. But something had changed. She started checking in more often, asking where files were, asking if reports had been finalized. I answered honestly, yes, they're ready. They're where they've always been. I shared access last week. Nothing confrontational. Nothing defensive. Just facts. She laughed it off. Made jokes about being overwhelmed. About growth pains. But I could feel her watching me now. Not suspicious. Curious. And curiosity, when mixed with entitlement, is dangerous. There was a moment, brief, sharp, when I thought she might confront me. It happened during a board meeting when someone asked about a discrepancy between two reports. I knew exactly what caused it. She looked at me. Just for a second. I met her eyes calmly. She answered anyway. Afterward, she pulled me aside. Did you notice that question? She asked. I did, I said. You could have jumped in. You didn't ask. She stared at me, searching for something. Guilt, maybe. Or reassurance. She found neither. Instead, she smiled tightly. Next time, she said. I nodded. There wouldn't be a next time like that. Because she was finally realizing something she should have understood from the beginning. I wasn't behind her. I was beneath the entire structure. And I was beginning to step away. Once someone realizes their footing isn't as solid as they believed, they start moving differently. Mara became careful in ways she never had before. She asked more questions. She followed up on emails she used to ignore. She started looping me into conversations she once handled alone. Not out of respect. Out of concern. I could feel the shift in her attention. It wasn't hostile. Not yet. It was investigative. Like she was trying to locate something she'd misplaced but couldn't quite name. I stayed exactly the same. Same tone. Same responsiveness. Same professionalism. People often mistake stillness for submission. But stillness can also be control. The organization was entering a sensitive phase. New funding meant audits. Reviews. External consultants who didn't care about charisma or reputation. They cared about documentation. Consistency. Process. All the things I had quietly built. And all the things Mara had never bothered to fully understand. She leaned on me more during this time, though she didn't phrase it that way. She framed it as collaboration. As teamwork. As mutual trust. I don't know what I'd do without you, she said once, laughing, after I'd corrected a reporting issue she hadn't noticed. I smiled. You'd figure it out. She didn't like that answer. The consultants arrived on a Monday morning. Neutral expressions. Crisp questions. No interest in stories, only systems. They wanted to see how decisions were made. Who approved what? Where accountability lived. Mara performed beautifully in the room. She always did. She spoke confidently about vision, mission, impact. Then they asked for records. That's when she started glancing at me more frequently. I provided everything they requested. Cleanly. Clearly. With timestamps. Version histories. Notes. What I didn't provide was interpretation. I didn't soften inconsistencies. I didn't contextualize verbal agreements. I didn't explain away gaps. I let the documents speak. At one point, one of the consultants paused, flipping through a file. These revisions, he said, they're thorough. Who finalized these? I did, I said. He nodded. And who approved them? There was a brief silence. Mara answered. I did. He looked back down. I don't see that reflected here. She laughed lightly. Oh, that must have been verbal. He didn't laugh back. That moment lingered in the air longer than it should have. After the meeting, Mara closed her office door. She didn't accuse me. She didn't raise her voice. She leaned back in her chair and studied me like a puzzle. You could have flagged that, she said calmly. I shared the approval process weeks ago, I replied. It's in writing. She exhaled slowly. You're being very literal lately. I nodded. It helps avoid confusion. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That was the first time I saw irritation break through her composure. Not anger. Not fear. Threat. From that point on, the atmosphere shifted. She began double-checking my work, asking for updates she never used to require, copying herself on emails unnecessarily. She was trying to reassert control. But control doesn't come from hovering. It comes from understanding. And she didn't understand what she'd been standing on all these years. There was a near miss a week later. I had stepped out early one evening when she stayed behind. I realized halfway home that I'd left a folder on my desk, one that contained internal notes. Not damaging, but revealing. A map of processes, responsibilities, dependencies. If she read it carefully, she might start connecting dots. I turned back. When I reached the office, the lights were still on. I paused outside, listening. Her voice drifted out, low, on the phone. Yes, she was saying. I just want to be sure everything's aligned. I waited. Quietly. When I entered, she looked up, startled. Oh, she said. I thought you left. I forgot something. Her eyes flicked briefly to the folder on my desk. Working late. I asked casually, just tying up loose ends. She watched me closely as I gathered my things. I could feel her measuring my movements, my expression, my tone. I smiled. Wished her a good night. As I walked out, my heart beat faster than usual. Not from fear. From confirmation. She was finally paying attention. Over the next few weeks, subtle pressure began to build around me. Nothing overt. Just small exclusions. Meetings rescheduled without notice. Decisions made before I was consulted. She was testing what would happen if she reduced my presence. I let her. Because by then, others had started noticing the difference. Reports took longer to finalize. Follow-ups lagged. Questions went unanswered longer than they should have. Not because I wasn't doing the work, but because no one else knew how to translate it. The board started asking for me by name. Can you have her walk us through this? I'd like her perspective on the data. Mara smiled through it. Agreed easily. But afterward, she was colder. You're becoming very visible, she said one afternoon. Not quite a compliment. I'm responding when asked. That's not what I mean. I met her gaze evenly. Then what do you mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she changed tactics. She began inviting me into strategy discussions again, complimenting my insight publicly, reframing our dynamic as partnership. It was almost convincing. Almost. Because I could hear the strain beneath it. The urgency. The realization that she might have misjudged the balance of power. And she was right. She had. What she didn't know was that the most delicate part of all this wasn't exposure. It was timing. Because the higher someone climbs without checking their foundation, the fewer options they have when it starts to crack. And she was very high up now. Power doesn't collapse all at once. It starts by making noise. Emails go unanswered. Decisions stall. People ask the same questions twice. By the time anyone calls it a problem, the damage is already layered too deeply to undo quietly. Mara began scheduling more meetings than necessary. Long ones. Strategic ones. The kind that look productive on calendars but rarely resolve anything. She filled them with vision talk and future plans, circling issues without ever landing on responsibility. I listened. Others did too. What used to feel inspiring now sounded repetitive, vague, untethered. I noticed how often she deferred specifics back to me mid-conversation. You can explain that better. You've been closer to the data. I did explain. Clearly. Precisely. And each time, I felt the room recalibrate. Not toward conflict. Toward clarity. The board commissioned a mid-cycle review. Not unusual. but earlier than expected. It came with requests for documentation, performance breakdowns, and governance alignment. Mara tried to frame it as routine. Just formalities, she said, smiling. They are very happy. She said that often now. How happy everyone was. How stable things were. People who feel stable don't usually need to say it out loud. I worked late most nights that month, preparing materials. Not to protect her. Not to expose her. To make sure the truth was legible. There's a difference. One evening, as I was organizing files, she appeared at my doorway. You're very thorough, she said, leaning against the frame. Sometimes I wonder if you enjoy this part more than the big picture. I enjoy accuracy, I replied. She studied me, head tilted. You've changed, she said lightly. No, I said. You're just noticing me. She laughed, a soft sound, but her eyes didn't join in. A week later, something happened that neither of us had planned for. An external partner requested a direct walkthrough of our operational systems. Not with Mara. With me. Specifically. The request was polite. Professional. Clear. Mara forwarded me the email with a short note. Let's discuss how to handle this. We met in her office. The blinds were half drawn, casting lines of shadow across her desk. They're overstepping, she said. It's unusual. They want clarity, I replied. She folded her hands. They trust me. Yes, I said. But they need process. Silence stretched between us. Finally, she smiled again, that careful smile she used when recalibrating. Fine, she said. We'll do it together. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. I prepared meticulously. Not just systems and reports, but contingencies. Questions they might ask. Scenarios they might explore. Mara prepared. Presence. She dressed impeccably, spoke smoothly, led with confidence. But the questions didn't stay on the surface. They asked about escalation paths, decision authority, risk management, who held final accountability when conflicts arose. Mara answered first, broadly. Then they asked me. And I answered, calmly, factually, sometimes in ways that didn't align perfectly with her framing. Not contradicting her. Clarifying. I could feel the tension building beside me. The subtle stiffness in her posture. The way she inhaled before I spoke, as if preparing to course correct. But she couldn't. Because nothing I said was wrong. After the meeting, she closed the door again. Her voice was controlled. Too controlled. You didn't need to go into that much detail. They asked. You could have deferred. They wanted specifics. She stared at me. You're enjoying this. I met her gaze. I'm doing my job. Something hardened then. Not anger. Calculation. Be careful, she said softly. People don't like surprises. Neither do those who rely on invisibility. The review results arrived 2 weeks later. They were mixed. Strong infrastructure. Impressive systems. Concerns about leadership alignment. Language like that doesn't accuse, but it doesn't absolve either. The board requested adjustments. Clearer delineation of roles. Documented approval processes. Formalized decision-making. In other words, boundaries. Mara presented the changes publicly as progress. As growth. As evidence of maturity. Privately, she blamed me. You made it seem like I wasn't involved, she said one night, her voice finally sharp. I showed how things work. That's not the same thing. It should be. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You think you're smarter than me? No, I said. I think I'm more careful. That was the moment something irreversible shifted. She stopped trying to include me after that. Stopped pretending at partnership. She began making unilateral moves, restructuring committees, shifting responsibilities, reframing narratives. But she was rushing now. And rushing introduces errors. I caught 3 inconsistencies in public statements she made. Numbers that didn't align with reports, timelines that contradicted documentation. Others noticed too. Questions followed. She deflected, smoothed, promised follow-ups. But credibility, once questioned, doesn't reset easily. One afternoon, a junior staff member came to me, nervous. "I don't know who to ask," they said. "But something doesn't add up." I listened. That was new. For years, concerns flowed upward toward her. Now they were moving laterally, toward me. I didn't encourage it. I didn't discourage it. I asked for details. Patterns began to emerge. Not wrongdoing, but misrepresentation. Overconfidence. Decisions made without understanding consequences. The kind of thing that goes unnoticed when results look good. The kind of thing that becomes very visible when scrutiny increases. Mara felt it. She began arriving earlier, staying later, calling emergency meetings, talking about loyalty, about trust. "You're either with me," she said once in a group meeting, smiling, "or you're in the way." Her eyes flicked to mine. I held her gaze. Neither of us smiled. What she didn't realize was that this wasn't about sides anymore. It was about exposure. And the higher you build your identity on being irreplaceable, the more devastating it is to discover that someone else understands the machine better than you ever did. I wasn't attacking her. I was letting the structure show itself. And structures don't take sides. They just reveal who was actually holding them together. There's a point in every slow collapse where denial becomes louder than logic. That's where Mara was now. She started speaking in absolutes. About loyalty. About intent. About who could be trusted and who couldn't. She framed disagreement as sabotage. Questions as betrayal. The organization felt it immediately. People became cautious in meetings. Emails were written and rewritten before being sent. Decisions that once took hours stretched into days. And through it all, Mara worked tirelessly to maintain the image of control. She scheduled a town hall. Public. Transparent. Confident. "I want us to realign," she said from the front of the room, hands open, voice warm. "There's been a lot of change. Some uncertainty. That's normal when you grow." People nodded. She spoke about values. About unity. About leadership as service. Then she did something unexpected. She mentioned me by name. "I also want to acknowledge the incredible operational work that happens behind the scenes," she said. "People like her make all of this possible." Applause followed. Polite. Measured. I smiled. Briefly. What she thought was generosity was actually containment. By praising me publicly, she was trying to close the narrative. Define my role. Frame me as support. But narratives don't stay closed when reality keeps contradicting them. After the town hall, a board member pulled me aside. "You okay?" they asked quietly. "I'm fine." They hesitated. "If you ever want to speak directly, my door's open." That door hadn't been open before. A few days later, Mara called me into her office again. This time, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "You've been talking to the board," she said flatly. "I answer questions when they ask. You go beyond what's necessary. I provide context." Her hands tightened around her pen. "You're undermining me." "No," I said. "I'm clarifying systems you don't fully engage with." Her face flushed slightly. "Careful." "I am." That word again. She leaned forward. "Do you know how easily I could replace you?" I met her gaze calmly. "Do you?" The silence that followed was long. Uncomfortable. Because we both knew the answer. She tried anyway. Over the next week, she reassigned parts of my workload. Brought in consultants. Delegated responsibilities to people who didn't yet understand the systems. Mistakes followed quickly. Missed deadlines. Incomplete reports. Confusion about approvals. Each issue required cleanup. By me. She called it transition. Others called it chaos. The board scheduled a closed-door session. Mara wasn't invited alone. Neither was I. They asked for separate statements. Mine was brief, factual, documented. Hers was passionate, visionary, defensive. They didn't decide anything immediately, but they asked follow-up questions. Many of them. One evening, long after most people had left, I was packing up when I heard voices in the hallway. Mara's. Sharp. Frustrated. "I don't understand how this is happening," she said to someone on the phone. "I built this." I paused, just out of sight. "No, I don't need another audit," she snapped. "This is internal politics." I felt something then, not satisfaction, not relief. Recognition. She had always believed success was something you owned, claimed, defended. She never understood that it was something you sustained. And sustaining requires humility. The next morning, she called an emergency leadership meeting. No agenda. No prep. That alone made people nervous. She spoke quickly. About external pressures. About betrayal disguised as professionalism. About how some people hid behind process to avoid accountability. Her eyes found mine more than once. When she finished, the room was quiet. Finally, someone spoke. A senior manager. Calm. Careful. "Can we talk about governance alignment?" they asked. "Because the board's concerns are structural, not personal." Mara froze for half a second. Then she smiled tightly. "Of course." But the damage was done. The conversation shifted. Away from loyalty. Toward clarity. Roles. Oversight. She lost control of the room. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. Afterward, she followed me into the hallway. "You think you've won," she said quietly. "I'm not competing," I replied. She laughed bitterly. "You always were." "No," I said. "I was building." She stepped closer. "If you push this any further, it won't end well." I met her eyes. For who? That was the moment she realized something she should have seen months ago. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was waiting. The board's final review was scheduled. Formal. Recorded. Conclusive. Mara began preparing statements. Reaching out to allies. Reinforcing her narrative. I prepared nothing new. Because everything that mattered was already in place. All that remained was for the structure to be examined fully, without distortion, without performance, without shortcuts. She had spent years believing that visibility was power. She was about to learn the cost of mistaking spotlight for stability. The week before the final review felt unreal. Too quiet. Mara stopped calling emergency meetings. Stopped sending late-night emails. She became measured again, composed, deliberate, almost serene. That worried me more than her panic ever had. People don't calm down when they feel safe. They calm down when they believe they've regained control. She requested one last private meeting with me. Not in her office. At a cafe across the street. Neutral ground. Public enough to discourage scenes. Personal enough to imply sincerity. She arrived early. Already seated. Coffee untouched. "I've been thinking," she said once I sat down, "about how this all got so complicated." "It didn't," I replied. "It just became visible." She smiled faintly. "You always reduce things to mechanics." "I trust them more than intentions." She nodded, as if conceding a point. Then she leaned in slightly. "We don't have to let this go any further," she said softly. "We can fix it. Reframe things. Present a united front." "At the review?" "Yes." "And then what?" I asked. Her pause was brief. Calculated. "Then we move forward." "Who's we?" I asked. She met my gaze. "You and me. Like before." Before, to her, meant when I stayed behind the curtain. I shook my head slowly. That version doesn't exist anymore. Her expression tightened. "You're making a mistake." "I made one years ago," I said. "This is correction." She sat back, studying me. "You think the board will choose you," she said. "They won't." They need a face. They need stability, I replied. She smiled then. Not warmly. You underestimate how this works. No, I said. I understand it differently. We finished our coffees in silence. The review took place on a Thursday morning. Formal. Recorded. Everyone present. Mara spoke first. She was polished. Confident. Calm. She framed the last year as growing pains. External pressures. Necessary adjustments. She acknowledged misalignment, strategically, without accepting fault. Then it was my turn. I didn't speak long. I walked them through systems. Governance. Approval flows. Documentation gaps. Decision dependencies. I showed how things actually moved. I answered questions directly. Without defensiveness. Without commentary on character. At one point, a board member asked something unexpected. If she were unavailable, they said, looking at me, could operations continue without disruption? Yes, I answered honestly. They turned to Mara. And if she were unavailable, they asked her, could operations continue? She hesitated. Just long enough. The room noticed. Afterward, we were asked to step out. The waiting room felt sterile. Neutral. Timeless. Mara paced. Then stopped. You planned this, she said quietly. I prepared, I replied. She laughed once, sharp. You let me walk into it. I didn't stop you, I said. She turned to face me. You could have warned me. I did, I said. Repeatedly. We were called back in separately. When I returned, the decision was already articulated. A restructuring. Leadership realignment. Mara would transition out of her role over the next quarter. Officially framed as mutual. Strategic. Respectful. I was asked to step into interim oversight, not as a public face, but as operational authority. Stability first. Mara didn't argue. She sat very still. The announcement was made the following week. Carefully worded. Gracious. Vague. She posted a statement about growth. About gratitude. About knowing when to step back. People responded with praise. With sadness. With surprise. Privately, my inbox filled with something else. Relief. People thanked me, quietly, for consistency. For listening. For keeping things running when it mattered. Mara cleared out her office in stages. We crossed paths once in the hallway during her final week. She looked tired. Smaller somehow. I never thought it would be you, she said. I know, I replied. She nodded slowly. You won. I shook my head. I stabilized. She watched me for a moment longer. Then turned and walked away. The organization didn't collapse. It didn't even falter. That was the most telling part. Systems held. People adapted. Work continued. Power, once stripped of illusion, is remarkably ordinary. People expect endings to feel dramatic. They imagine raised voices. Public reckonings. Some final line that seals everything shut. But real endings are quieter than that. They sound like normal mornings. The first Monday after Mara officially stepped away, I arrived early out of habit. The building was still half asleep. Lights dimmed. Coffee machine humming softly in the background. Nothing felt different. And that was the point. I sat at my desk and opened my inbox. No emergencies. No frantic messages. No last-minute clarifications that only one person could authorize. Work moved forward without hesitation. Meetings started on time. Decisions followed documented paths. Questions were answered without politics layered over them. For the first time in years, the organization felt breathable. People didn't say much about Mara anymore. Not out of disrespect, but because the gravity she once held had quietly released. When someone leaves a system that no longer depends on them, the absence fades faster than expected. A few weeks later, the board confirmed the permanent structure. No single face. No central hero. Distributed leadership. Clear accountability. Shared authority. They offered me a more visible role. Public-facing. Symbolic. I declined. I stayed where I'd always been most effective. Some people were surprised by that. They assumed my patience had been ambition in disguise. But ambition was never the point. Accuracy was. On a rainy afternoon months later, I ran into Mara by chance. A bookstore cafe. Neutral territory again. She looked different, not defeated, but stripped of urgency, like someone who had finally stopped performing. We exchanged brief pleasantries. Nothing heavy. As we stood to leave, she hesitated. I still don't know when it started, she said quietly. When you decided to do all this. I considered that. I didn't decide, I said. I noticed. She nodded slowly. I wish I had. So do I. She gave a small, rueful smile. You never needed the spotlight, did you? No, I said. Just the truth. We parted without ceremony. I didn't feel victorious walking away. I felt finished. That's the difference. Revenge wants witnesses. Resolution doesn't. Years from now, people will remember her as a founder, a visionary, a phase in the organization's history. They'll remember me differently, if at all. And that's fine. Because every system carries fingerprints you don't see. Quiet hands that held things together long before anyone noticed they mattered. I still work late sometimes. Still notice small fractures before they spread. Still document everything. The world hasn't changed. But I stand differently inside it now. No longer invisible. No longer waiting. Just present. And that's enough.